Given that all of this is about the great work of the New School of Sustainability and where John Doerr's Speed and Scale is headed, we now have a panel directly related to this great body of work. Come on, guys, come sit. They'll each introduce each other. I'll introduce Fred von Berningen. By the way, that's after years of finally getting Joe Deitch right, even though his E comes first. And in Bernstein and Ginger now, the E comes first, but that doesn't matter. And with Fred, it took me 31 tries to get that right. So we are an international group, and it is important to respect one's name. So with that, my dear friend, let me also say that Mike Steep, when we were literally looking at the world and trying to figure out who we thought might be the combination of Asian wisdom with the complete open-mindedness that only comes from having done so much in that realm, Fred was the very obvious first choice of Mike's in many, many ways. He's got a very lengthy bio. Please read it. I will just tell you that he is the advisor to the European Union's Innovation Foundation and Fund. He is also the national advisor to the Dutch government for the entire hydrogen economy. So with that, and by the way, for you YPO members, Fred actually has, I think, created the YPO sustainability. Correct. Yeah. So author of, so deeply impassioned and routed in this area. And so I'll let you go through and have everybody introduce themselves, and really anxious to have this panel. So yeah. Have fun.
Should we do that, or shall we stick to the plan, or you do that?
Yeah.
Stick to the plan?
Yeah, we got a plan.
We'll stick to the plan,
Go
Rob.
to the plan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The plan is to do like a 15-minute, 20-minute introduction to the panel with some content, and then the introduction will follow after that, because you will do your own introductions, and then we'll have ample time for the panel discussion. So first off, thanks for having me, of course. And it was mentioned I am Dutch, indeed. And I don't know if Barry's still around from Silicon Valley Bank, but no longer. Because when I heard that our country was half underwater, I found home, of course, immediately. And I can reassure you, as before, for centuries, we are not half on water, but we are half under the sea level. So, small nuance, but not unimportant. I would also add that being in our position, having to deal with this for centuries and having reclaimed land from the sea, we may be in a better prepared position than some other areas in the world for sea level rise. But anyway, that's just on that. So let's start here a little bit on climate. This is only meant to set the scene, and I read books. And the ones on there you see Hot Air, Hot House Earth, Bill McQuire, UK-based climate scientist, is all about science. And what does it tell you? Well, I should be careful with my language, but we're in a difficult position. Yeah.
That's putting it mildly.
And it's all about tipping points. You know that, the methane and the Arctic and etc. It's about tipping points. So that's that part. This book, and Bobby, we were both impressed, I think, by Toby Ord. It's a year old, I think. It's a moral philosopher from Oxford. Already quite interesting background to write about science. It's very science-based and fact-based, but he has an engineering degree also. And he talks about existential threats to humanity. He mentions 4. Climate is one of them. And an existential threat to humanity, just to define it, is a threat to the future potential of humanity. So it's not like an asteroid that destroys all of us, like the dinosaurs before, but it can sort of hurt the future potential of humanity. The other ones, just to be complete, are pandemics, not surprisingly, nuclear war, so it's all very merry, and then AI. And that's, I would sort of, for those who find it interesting, is an interesting chapter too. But let's stick to the climate. So just to remind everybody, this is IPCC. And I just wanted to bring this up to sort of bring the urgency back, because we have literally a decade. So if you want to stay within the agreed sort of boundaries of 1.5 degrees, And if you look at the carbon budget, and let's not go into numbers, it's very simple. We have like 8 to 10 years. So if you think about that, and I will explore this a little bit more. So here I made a few notes because I think it's worth sort of laying out the thinking behind this slide, and hopefully it creates a bit of a shared view on this problem. And it starts a little bit with history, when we were still working with mussels and water and biomass. And humanity, of course, was very aware of the limited quantity and the intermittent quality of the sources of energy, obviously, because you had to deal with that from day to day. Then something happened. We found how to extract stocks of prehistoric. So, sorry, I'm using a few notes because I'm not like Peter from this morning. I lead a venture capital firm, so we mostly work in the background and not in But anyway, so I use a few. That changed, of course, in the early 19th century when we found a way to extract minerals from the earth. And then we combined it with machines and a few liters of fuel, and suddenly we could do more work than humans could be. We could do more work than all the humans together. So that's what happened. But then the problem was that this access to sort of let's call it prehistoric photosynthesis turbocharged our development. It turbocharged the population, turbocharged technology, turbocharged economic development, and there we are. Now the way we looked at cities, transportation, and etc. The problem is, and that's the carbon pulse you see in the middle. That's started, 150, 200 years ago. But the problem with the carbon pulse, of course, is that it sort of, this sort of spike in production and consumption, we first neglected and then forgot about the relationship with nature. And there's an interesting statistic, and that's why I have my notes. I need to look that up. So living in the carbon pulse, we are in the carbon pulse, trying to get out of it, of course. We draw on the Earth's, let's call it energy battery, in a way that is millions times faster than, of course, this battery was replenished by the daily supply of photosynthesis. And we do that. So you can argue, is that wise? Was that wise with hindsight? And the data point is interesting. The last 200 years, we used what it took 200 million years to build. So that is sort of the interesting statistics here. In 1 year, we used 4.3 million years. So that's, by the way, 22 times the time that we, as a species, have been roaming this Earth. So if you have a sense for a law of physics, you think there's something wrong here. There's a disequilibrium, obviously. Now, we've had the wisdom of doing all this, humans. Like a friend of my ex-Shell colleague would call us mildly intelligent but highly social apes. And we thought this was a good idea. And we modeled our cities and consumption patterns and everything to this depletion of the carbon, the spike here. While science can not ignore the facts, economic models can. So science cannot ignore reality, but economic science can. So we built also economic models and a narrative that it was the human ingenuity that made this growth happen. It was not the sort of the gift that the history had given us. No, it was us who made this happen. So in our economic models, we ignored waste, we ignored social impact, we ignored, many things, and that's of course the price we pay today. So I just wanted to paint a little bit the perspective, and also the last point here is that if we look into the future, we have to realize so the energy blindness, if you want, has to become energy realism, and one of the things we need to be realistic about is that the sources of energy will be less dense than oil. And the way to produce, distribute, and consume energy will be more complex. So there's no immediate reason, in spite of many techno-optimists that would say that it's going to, zero marginal cost and all that. There's no immediate, bar the war that's going on in Europe, but there's no immediate reason to think that it will all be simpler and cheaper and etc. So anyway, that's just a little bit on this. The other thing, and that's perhaps a little bit of a European thing, But just as a data point, our material, I'm going to talk about materials now, because of course energy and materials is what our society is built on. Some argue that information is also physical property of the universe, but I think that's a different topic. But our sort of material productivity peaked already in the 80s. So if you realize that, and on top of that we build a linear economic model. So we extract at cost, and we think that's reasonable. We don't include, of course, the externalities of extracting the minerals from the earth. Then we use it and dispose of it. That's the economic model we've built. So I just want to make you aware also that what is called popularly the circular economy, so bringing materials in circular loops and keep it at the highest value, is an essential part also of carbon neutral strategies. Keep moving. So I just wanted to give you our definition of investing in sustainability. After all, School of Sustainability, I think the conference theme is also around sustainability. It was defined this morning, also sustainability. So we define it like this, but that is of course from the lens of investing and technology. And there are those three areas that we think are very exciting, and of course we can go into many examples. That's just for definition. Now let us go to the opportunity. I want to give a flavor for that too. So you have, we're in the US here, so there are 84 companies of the MSCI World Index of the top 100 companies have pledged carbon neutrality, mostly by 2050. Sometimes you wonder, is it scope 1 only, or is it also scope 2? Often it's scope 1 and 2, scope 3 is a little bit more tricky. You have an outlier like Microsoft that even wants to compensate for their historic emissions. But then, just to make you aware, if you want to get to carbon neutral by 2050, you need to get to carbon negative by 2030. And that is very short term. And it's very telling that when companies announce carbon neutral, the stock price barely moves. There's good economic reporting on that. And the reason for that can be twofold. The cynical view is the analysts don't care. And the more, let's say, rational view is that they don't believe it. So there will be a lot of pressure on these large companies to get on this path to carbon neutral, and it will unleash, that's our thesis of course, it will unleash a lot of innovation and technology opportunities. About value creation, that is of course the flip side of this whole discussion, because it's a lot of, if you look at this as an economic problem, there's a lot of sort of I call it threat-related discussions around higher cost of capital. There is, I think, already quite a delta between revenue-producing green assets and fossil assets. So there's that, then there's demand problems, stranded assets, and etc. But parallel to that, you can think about the value creation that results from carbon neutral, this huge mega-trend of carbon neutral. And that is an important opportunity, and you see some sort of strategies around that. Now, this is BCG work, by the way. The work before was from McKinsey, quite recent. But this would suggest that 70%, and I think that will be perhaps also part of the panel discussion, so what are the levers that we have, but that 70% of the technologies to decarbonize those industries. And I want to make another point, that these industries that are difficult to decarbonize, like chemicals, oil and gas, mining, shipping, cement, they're not going away. So in spite of all the ESG thinking in the world and all these sort of conferences around, financiers talking about ESG, they're not going away. You stop mining, you stop the energy transition. You stop chemicals, you stop life as we know it, including pharmaceuticals. So that's not going to happen. So the only realistic option in the time that we have is to decouple the emissions from their growth. And that's a technology problem. That is to a large extent a technology problem. So 70%, according to this overview, of the technologies needed are either in early adoption or not yet commercially available. So that's a huge opportunity space for early stage investment. Well, a bit busy slide. Maybe I should skip it. Look it up. This is the McKinsey work I was talking about, and it sort of these are addressable markets in these different areas. So you can look it up. It's all big numbers. Busy slide. To realize that, I was encouraged to work with visual slides only, but I sort of kept this one because look at the themes: carbon as a resource, circularity, material substitution, alternative fuels, efficiency. The whole area, and that will be part, I know, of the panel discussion, or the whole area of nature-based solutions, we would call it negative emission technologies. Because again, going back to the beginning of the introduction, if you want to get to carbon neutral 2050, you need to get to carbon negative 2030, which means that probably in your strategy you have to include negative emission technologies. You need to do something to put you on the timeline. So that's an important area. And those can be engineered, like direct air capture, or bioenergy with capture, but also the nature-based solutions. And then the whole area of carbon markets, we will also talk about. Is it an enabler? Is it an economic opportunity in itself? So we'll talk about that. Most of this is technology-driven, and so we'll talk a little bit more. And then just the size of the challenge. You guys have seen this. So talking about forestry, for example, as a nature-based solution. If you want to make a dent, that's what you're talking about, right? So, and unfortunately, the most space we have of planting trees is probably in places like South America or Russia, for that matter, or Canada perhaps. But anyway, it's huge. And direct air capture, take another example, is that. So you start to feel like this is not going to happen. So we need to do more, and we need to really work with these industries. Last slide, just to also busy, I recognize that. I did include the Inflation Reduction Act there on the right side. It sort of describes a little bit the timeline of clean tech and climate tech, because those of you in the financial industry, you probably know that not many funds made money actually in clean tech, a very difficult space. And that timeline is set out here. But now we're very bullish, and there are a couple of reasons. There are the fundamental trends and drivers. There's the access to capital, growth capital, for example, with the BlackRocks and the Temaseks and the General Atlantics and the Amazons and etc. But also access to non-dilutive capital. You were alluding to my role in Europe with the European Innovation Fund. It's a sizable fund, deploying grants to unlock demand for hydrogen, for example, carbon utilization and etc. Inflation Reduction Act, if we have a drink, I have an opinion, but I will not offer it now. So I think with this, it's just meant to set the scene a little bit. Hopefully it helps the panelists also to sort of at least, but we need to do introductions. And so my first question, and probably also my last, knowing you a little bit, maybe there will be a second, but my first question is really, who are you? And what are you doing in the context of climate? Can I start with you, Julia?
Absolutely. Oh, is my mic on? There we go. Hi, everyone. I'm really honored to be here. My name is Julia Jackson, and my family owns one of the largest family-owned wine businesses in the world, Jackson Family Wines. I decided to take leave from my family business about 6 years ago because I became really urgent about the climate crisis. I'm blessed to have philanthropic capital to be able to donate to climate solutions and also in ESG investments that are for-profit climate solutions. So I'm not currently working in my family business. I'm a second generation proprietor. I, about 5 years ago, had the crazy idea to start my own organization, galvanizing climate solutionists together. We started with a summit. It's grounded.org, bringing solutionists in regenerative ag, ocean, blue carbon solutionists, algae-based plastic alternative solutionists, circularity solutionists, all the negative emissions solutionists, and also renewable energy infrastructure solutionists together, because I'd been to a lot of climate conferences, and it felt like there were a lot of CEOs who will also be a huge part of drawing down carbon and the solution, but it felt like these conferences didn't actually have the solutionists on stage. They had CEOs and world leaders. Meanwhile, we're heading off of a cliff. So I, out of, I guess you could say, fear and desperation, 5 years ago, read a book called Drawdown by Paul Hawken. Met Paul, he mentored me. And that book was really inspiring for me because it modeled and measured 100 solutions to turn around the climate crisis. Since then, I've joined 7 boards that are all climate solutions focused. So I wear sort of 2 hats, one running an organization, grounded.org, and 2 donating to what I see as the most credible climate solutions organizations, because less than 2% of philanthropic giving goes to the environment. And you've got a lot of these NGOs competing for a very tiny slice of the pie in terms of financial donations towards the environment. But I see it as, if we don't have a planet, there will be no profits to be made. There will be no wine industry. And most importantly, my generation, millennial, and my nephews and my niece will not have a livable Earth. And I don't mean to seem like an alarmist, but we really only have 7.5 years to turn around the climate crisis before we are heading towards an uninhabitable Earth. And just to put it into context, only 6 countries are on track to reach the Paris Agreement. The US is actually on track to reach 4 degrees Celsius by 2100. And we are releasing attuned to 37 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere every year. And we are currently at 422 parts per million of carbon concentration up into the atmosphere. And I think it was Bill McKibben that said the point of no return is 450 parts per million. And 1 part per million, I like to read too. So 1 part per million is equal to 8 billion tons of CO2. So if you like think about it, if we're releasing 3 to 4 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, or 3 to 4 times 8 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, that's a gigantic amount that's accumulating and creating hot house Earth. And it's being trapped up there. And so, and I'll wrap this up because I want to pass it along. But basically what we need to do and what I'm working on is how do we stop further emissions from heading into the atmosphere? And there's all sorts of solutions to that in terms of renewable energy infrastructure, coalition building, and getting off of fossil fuels. And 2, how do we draw down atmospheric carbon? Hence the title of the book, Drawdown. Because we do need to store that carbon, bring it back down. Like what goes up must come down. That is very true of what's happening with emissions. And so I focus a lot on policy and legislation around carbon sinks, areas around the world that can store carbon that have been mapped out. What are the most effective carbon sinks in the world that we absolutely must protect or restore? And those could be in the ocean as well, like mangroves, seagrasses, wetlands, coral reef ecosystems, keystone species. And the Amazon I've invested in, the Amazon, and Jonah will go into that as well, why it's so important, and what are the major areas of the Earth that are nature-based solutions that we have to restore and protect. So yeah, I work with Indigenous communities. I work with a lot of scientists, conservationists, biologists, keystone species experts, and also policymakers and legislators with my organization, Grounded. Thank you for having me.
Jonah,
Thank you. When I hear her talking about the urgency of the climate, I feel my heart moving faster. I want to invite everyone to close your eyes for a moment. And let's imagine a stable climate and how relieving that tension makes so much possible for us as a species. And now imagine that the group that made that possible was in this room today with you. Open your eyes. The people in this room have the capacity to change the future of this planet. I've seen that, I've felt that. I've worked on it for the past 20 years. 20 years ago, I co-founded a global association of youth organizations around the United Nations called the Global Youth Action Network. By our 3rd year, we mobilized 1 million people. I met young inheritors along the way. I met young activists from every country in the world. I became a gateway drug to impact. I then got involved in building technology for the 2007-8 Obama campaign and met changemakers all over the world in a different matter. And then I was able to persuade the White House to host its first ever Young Philanthropy Summit. I got the ability to reach out and contact 95% of the billionaire families in the United States, invite them to send kids and grandkids to the White House. I brought that network to the United Nations and created a new organization called Nexus. Nexus is a movement to bridge communities of wealth and impact. Can you raise your hand if you've heard of Nexus? 5 years ago, I reduced my role in order to create new platforms for intergenerational philanthropic learning and collaboration. The elder generations have got a lot of power. The younger generations have the talent, energy, and access, and new consciousness that allows that to be expressed. Over the past 5 years, I've created 3 new platforms. One, the Healthy Democracy Coalition, to bring together Republican and Democrat philanthropists to help conserve democracy. I merged that with the Leadership Now project. I created the Global Governance Philanthropy Network to unite ocean, climate, and refugee funders around governance solutions to global problems. While trying to work on global governance reform, I learned about the urgency of the Amazon rainforest. In 2016, climate models came out that showed that the Amazon is right at this edge of a tipping point. 70% of the rainfall that falls on the Amazon comes from the Amazon itself. Deforestation creates local drought that spreads, kind of like a virus. In 2018, Carlos Nobre, a Nobel climate scientist, along with Tom Lovejoy, published the urgency of this issue. Within the next 10 years, if we don't stop deforestation, it will release this positive feedback loop that will release 123 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere by basically half of the Amazon forest and more drying up and burning away and turning into an arid grassland. To give you an idea, 123 gigatons of carbon dioxide. There's 860 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere. This is a giant amount of carbon. But there's an extraordinary opportunity at the end of the tunnel, and this is it. 70 million hectares of the Brazilian Amazon have been deforested since 1970. Cattle ranching, which is the dominant industry, earns $250 per year per hectare. Soy earns $1,000 per year per hectare. If you aggregate that together, it earns locals $20 billion a year. That economic narrative has been driving deforestation. But if you replace that cattle and soy system with an agroforestry polyculture, then you can sequester a buttload, pardon my French, of carbon. How much? If you simply allow the deforested Brazilian Amazon to regrow, it would be worth over $1 trillion on current carbon markets. It's a massive amount of money. If you were to replace that with your average agroforestry polyculture, which means timber and rubber and Brazil nuts and acai, et cetera, rather than $250 per hectare as cattle, $3,700 a year for your average agroforestry polyculture. Mahogany itself would take in $8,000 a year. What's missing? What's missing is the mobilization of the world's family offices to jump in and get involved in this giant business opportunity. $20 billion a year for business as is, $175 billion a year for an agroforestry economic system for the Amazon. What is needed? I've got a list here of, it means investment readiness, it means gathering data. I'm going to wait for another moment in the panel to tell you all these on-ramps to get involved. Thank you.
Right. Like I said, I will probably ask only one question in this panel, so that's fine. But I have a second one based on your introduction. So, Mike.
I'll try my best to speed up the introduction part of the panel. Mike Kierstead, Head of Environmental Products at the Intercontinental Exchange, based out of Calgary, Alberta in Canada. So real quickly, I'll tell a personal and a professional story. So personally, if Canada is America's hat, the boreal forest is North America's toque. And that's my backyard playground. So summers are getting warmer and drier, as are winters, so that's devastating for the snowpack, for fresh water. The forests are getting drier. There's pine beetle. There's basically matchsticks. So wildfires are ruining the summer months as far as livelihoods and smoke, drought, etc. So my focus is on the carbon markets at the Intercontinental Exchange. So both professionally and personally, it's very important to me. When I started in these markets, I was actually on a power trading desk. And from Alberta, we could wheel power through British Columbia, through Washington State, Oregon, and into California. There was an arbitrage there. It was cheap power in the night in Alberta, more expensive in California. So even with the line losses and the foreign exchange, you could still do that. Up until around 2012, 2013, when the California Cap and Trade program started. And what they did is they added a carbon adder to the dirty power of Alberta, which would be coal, natural gas, a lot of the fossil fuel fired generation. And that was an aha moment for me. That was really the start of regional energy transition, net zero, ESG, call it what you want. But that arbitrage went away overnight because you then had to pay a carbon adder in order to wheel that power into California. So that's what switched my career path from power and electricity generation, or at least fossil fuel electricity generation, to more green and sustainable ways to power the grid. That's it for me, real quick.
Good
Go
intro.
ahead.
Yeah. Bobby, you want to go next?
We've talked a lot today about radical transparency and vulnerability. And I'm feeling really emotional right now. So I'll be really honest with you. Last night when I got home from the reception, which I want to say I'm really honoured to be here. I've really enjoyed working with a number of the crew to help bring this together. It's been an absolute pleasure and delight. And I woke up in the middle of the night thinking about the challenge that we have in front of us and what our responsibility is to actually take stock of what's happening. Now, it doesn't matter where you come from around how we got to this place, but the facts are there, the science is there. We're in a deeply, deeply troubled crisis state. And these climate extremes are with us to stay. Now, we've heard the facts. We can go through all the facts. We're seeing what's happening in Europe. We're seeing glaciers disintegrating. We're seeing the Rhine dry up so that the German, they can't get supplies in. We're seeing fires in California. I was home in Australia for the huge fires that hit Australia. They were of planetary proportions. It was terrifying. And I don't care where you come from in the standpoint, but let's face the facts and let's be real. And to Jonah's point, everyone in this room can lead, take the lead. We can galvanize this community and we can actually put capital where it needs to go. Now, unless we do that, as to Julia's point, what's the point of accumulating wealth? What's the point of profit when there is no planet? I'm less concerned about the planet than I am for humanity. I think as a species, we're in deep shit. So the way I come at this is slightly skewed. I've worked at the intersection of climate, energy, water, food, and financial security for decades now. And I was thinking about climate refugees before that term was even coined. And I've talked about being part of the climate finance arena before that was even termed. So these are the things I have a capacity, I don't know why, but I can see trends before they're even become part of the vernacular. And so what I've done with my energy and time, and I redouble my efforts every single moment of the day, is to actually work to see how we can drive capital to exponential technology solving big global challenges. And climate is the overarching meta issue of our time, in my opinion. Now, the way I come at it is I see we are at a juncture of ecological crisis and crisis of meaning. And that is something we need to take stock of. I'm thinking along the lines of the capabilities, the critical capabilities that we need going forward are adaptability and resiliency. Sustainability for me is a question mark, whether that's even possible. But resiliency and adaptability are. So I'm looking at the tools in which we can actually come to resiliency and adaptability, and the tools that I use to get through one of the most difficult periods of my life, when I lost 25 people very close to me in the last few years, including my extraordinary sister, Dr. Kim Dunphy OAM, and my extraordinary brother-in-law, who was the CEO of Marriott and on the board of Microsoft. And so I was on my knees, and I'm like, how do we get back up? How do I find my way through? How do I find meaning in my life? What am I here on this planet to do? And what are we all on this planet to do together? And I got back up off my knees using a whole series of tools, including psychedelic medicines. I'm going to name that. That's something that I think the science is there as well, and that will be one of the tools that will help us take agency in our lives and come to a place where we can actually see our way forward and really get to work on this. Now, the solutions, as Julia mentioned, there are solutionists. There are, we can be looking at ocean health with blue carbon. We can be looking at soil health. We can look at all of the drawdown technologies, both nature-based and technological, and we can bring them to pass. We just need to actually move together and mobilize together, and that's what I'd like to posit to you as a community now. I think we can really do this together. So that's what I want to say for now.
Okay, right. So I can ask a second question, so that's great. I want to pick up on the, we talked about before the panel, and that's maybe a good thing to add to what you were saying for the people here, that if you look at this, you receive all the data, you all have the backgrounds and intelligence of sort of give interpretation to the data, and then you choose your position. The question is, and that was also a little bit in my introduction, you can be energy blind or energy realist. You can be climate blind or climate realist. So what does it take? And that's probably sort of an inner journey. So Bobby, you and I shared that I'm to also be a little bit vulnerable. It's not very European, but still. We are, I think, Vipassana practitioners, and it's not that you become a Buddhist, but it sort of brings you in a space where you look at reality as it is and not as you want it to be. But that is hard sometimes. So I totally understand. You get all this information, but you still find the psychological mechanisms to shut it out and sort of carry on with your business. And so I have a lot of empathy with that. On the other hand, there are advantages of being in a place of looking at reality as it is. Because of course then you can chart your actions. But anyway, so that's just, so thanks for bringing that up. The second question I had was also sort of technical, if you want, and start with Jonah and Julia perhaps, and then Mike, if you can also think about how your activity is an enabler for the sort of decarbonization and energy transition. And but the question is, and this is again perhaps also a little bit European perspective. Europe wants to become the first carbon neutral continent, and the politicians are really behind the idea. But we use the word system transition a lot. It's a transition. It's a complex system that needs to go from one place to another place. You are talking about the way you were passionately were talking, Jonah, if I can start with you, passionately talking about this problem and the solution. And you said we just need to deploy the capital and then it will happen. It can't be that simple, the Amazon. So can you talk a little bit to where to start, and without going into a lecture on how this project works, because we don't have time for that. But what are the system change aspects of your challenge, and why do you think they can be solved?
Let's start with California. In 2013, Princeton published a study saying that if the Amazon overruns its tipping point, then the Sierra Nevada snowpack will lose 50% of its precipitation. That means the collapse of the agricultural industry here. That means some of California's cities, the water table will lower, they can become unlivable cities. So let's talk about mobilizing California to recognize this existential challenge. The NASA calls the Amazon the center of the global water cycle. It propagates these rain patterns that stabilize the global climate. The reason why rain looks like it does is because of these patterns that are coming out of the Amazon region. So what are the pathways? What can a business family that has philanthropy, an operating business, and investment do to get involved? I've got a laundry list for you. 1, legal compliance. There are some rule of law issues in Brazil and other parts of the Amazon. Some parts of the Amazon, it's the highest concentration of environmentalist assassinations that take place. It's a minority of the regions. Don't worry, if you're afraid of assassinations, just like me, you can do plenty of stuff in the Amazon without ever worrying about that part of it. I just named that for the human rights philanthropists that are out there. But what other kind of legal compliance things are there? On the ease of doing business index that the World Bank, I think it is, that puts it out every year, Brazil is like number 30 out of 196 or 193 member states. A lot can be done to make it easier to operate a business in the region. This brings in California. FinTech is a very important thing. There needs to be an opportunity to facilitate last mile financial transactions in the region. If you have a startup that can do that without having access to the web, there are a lot of people who will be able to adopt your technology. There are 30 million people living in the Amazon. Many of them don't yet have internet access. A giant fraction of them are actually in urban areas, but the majority that we need to worry about urgently are those in the rural Amazon. Carbon markets. Who raise your hand if you've heard of the California Tropical Forest Standard? In 2019, a giant debate happened between the environmentalists and the indigenous advocates in this state, and a protocol was advanced, was approved after a decade, saying, yes, here's the mechanism by which California carbon markets can fund forest restoration and forest protection all over the world. Because of a lack of political will and change in the governorship, it did not get integrated with California's cap and trade system. The protocol is there, political will is needed. If you're a California policy philanthropist, flip on the California Tropical Forest Standard.
Jonah, I'm going to jump in with the most unpleasant task that a moderator has, but I know we have 8 minutes left for the panel.
1 more minute.
So no, no. I just want, because there will be opportunity to connect separately. But from what you're saying, you have your whole list. But your answer is yes, we have considered that.
Yes.
It's a transition where we have a theory of change for.
Right. He can post his recommendations into the digital folder.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. I think the digital folder will have sort of the possibility of. Documents and sure. Yeah.
One sentence, AmazonInvestor.org. There's a global coalition working on this.
There you go. So,
and it's fantastic. I'm part of it.
Julia, I wanted, but if you don't like the question, you can just say something else.
Well, I'll be more brief. Sorry, I was a little lengthy in the beginning, but just firstly, I wanted to acknowledge what Bobby brought up, because oftentimes eco-anxiety and climate grief are overlooked, and without a functioning prefrontal cortex, that's the CEO decision-making part of your brain, and fear shuts that down. And so we must operate from a place of love and not fear. And that's been a personal journey I've been on. And when I first started out in this space, I was desperately afraid. And now I'm much more grounded, and I've had to heal myself from PTSD, losing my house to the Kincaid fire, which was, I've experienced the climate crisis firsthand. And I think coming through that journey, I feel more optimistic now that we actually can, maybe it's utopian, turn this around, because I'm in a community of solutionists. I think way more people are working up to this crisis. And I think there's many solutions you can plug your capital into it. From a for-profit standpoint, I've been diversifying some of my family wealth and investing in textile alternatives, electric tractors. I'm going to invest in fusion. I mean, there's so many opportunities to really significantly grow your wealth in high impact climate solutions. So if anyone wants to learn more about that, I'm happy to chat about that. Not that I'm an expert, but I am seeing a lot of great for-profit solutions. And then lastly, in the nonprofit world, I would say one of the most underfunded but most critically important solutions to the climate crisis is supporting frontline Indigenous organizations, because 80% of biodiversity is on Indigenous territories, yet they're often left out of these rooms. And often don't have access to these rooms and people with capital. Yet they are literally stewarding earth carbon, terrestrial carbon, and species, the Amazon. I mean, these guys are the Avenger heroes of our time, and we're committing genocide and wiping out their territories. So there's an amazing coalition of Indigenous-run organizations, one of which I've supported, Amazon Frontlines, and through the capital I was able to provide them with Leonardo DiCaprio. They were able to secure 23 million acres through free, prior, and informed consent and stopping extractive industries from taking over that territory. So that just shows what philanthropic capital can do with, it was actually only $25,000 that I donated to them, but they are so responsible with capital because they don't often get a lot of it. And a lot of larger NGOs, environmental NGOs, a lot of the money goes to the overhead. And anyways, that's it. That's an area that I'm very passionate about and have seen major return on investment philanthropically as Indigenous communities.
Thank you. I'll bring it back to deep decarbonization of industrial sectors or corporates, if you want. Mike, so the question to you is, it would be great if you can have we're a little bit under time pressure, but this question of the carbon markets, what do you see there? How is it going to enable deep decarbonization?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So just want to be very careful on the taxonomy here versus compliance markets versus voluntary. I really don't like the word voluntary, because if you're making a pledge to your shareholders that you're going to be net zero or net neutral, negative, whatever, by a certain date, you're mandated to do that. It really shouldn't be called the voluntary carbon market. You're making that pledge, you're making that mandate, you're going out and buying those credits associated with that, whether it's nature-based, blue ocean, tech, those credits are all available, whether it's bilateral on an exchange or however you want to procure them through auctions. The compliance markets, which we mentioned earlier, there's the California Cap and Trade, there's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the US Northeast, there's the EUA market, which is Europe, and then the UK market. Those are the 4 cap and trade programs that trade as futures on the exchange. They're an excellent store of value, an excellent asset to procure. You can hold them physically, and I say that with air quotes because it's all electronic on an exchange, but you're making and taking delivery of these. And if you believe, and everyone in this room should, that as we move forward in time, these credits, these allowances are going to become more scarce. There's more hands looking to grab them. What's going to happen to the price? It'll increase. So that store of value is very important. And whether you have a compliance obligation, whether you're a fossil fuel generator, a refiner, a cement manufacturer, or petrochemicals with heavy industrial CO2 exposure, or you're looking to do it on your own to fulfill a pledge, it's really important to understand that these markets aren't going anywhere. They're a commodity, and they're truly a very strong store of value in the medium term.
Excellent, thanks. That was exactly, I think, the right input here on that topic. You have the almost last word, so...
Well, I don't necessarily want to have the last
no,
word, but what almost. I do want to say is that I actually advise to principals and next-gen members of family offices around how to align their philanthropic giving and investment capital with their value sets, and what that really comes down to is what they care about. What I'm witnessing, and which gives me great hope, because we all need hope, let's face it, right now, is that there's a sea change happening. And people are starting to actually, whether they're having personal epiphanies around what's actually going down with climate and climate extremes, or they're actually realizing that there's a market and there's profit to be made, there's a sea change happening. So it's very encouraging. I'm also advising to a group called Air Capture, which is a direct air capture technology company that's drawing down CO2 and sequestering and then putting it into product. And I think that these are the sorts of things, along with nature-based solutions for oceans, all the stuff that we're all involved in. We've been involved in this arena for a long time. And so the combined know-how on this panel is pretty deep. What I want to recommend to you is if you have any further questions, we're here to help, we're here to advise, we're here to bring you in if you haven't. Can I ask you, I plead with you to stop thinking about things and actually take action. Stop sitting back. We need, it's all hands on deck right now. So let's do this together.
Very excited. So we're right on time. I said almost last word. Before I thank the panel, I just want to mention, I think it was implicit in my introduction, but I manage a global venture capital firm, and we've been doing this for 20 years. We invested in Fusion 8 years ago in what we think is one of the better companies, General Fusion. Carbon capture, a company called Swante that did its Series D with Temasek leading, power electronics, all sorts of things. So there's some experience, because it's when it comes to technology investing, I think it pays off to have the experience and to know where to look and what to do. But just as a complementary thing to the nature-based solutions and the sort of carbon markets, technology will have to come into it also. And as I argued, it offers a great opportunity for venture capital.
And can
So
I just
with
add
that,
one thing? If anyone has a donor advised fund and is finding it difficult to move capital from that into direct investments into climate, we can help with that as well, because I think that's an untapped arena and there's a lot of money sitting on the sidelines that we could actually put to work. So I just wanted to say
still
that.
have the last word.
Sorry, no, you do. Go ahead.
Fine. Thank you, panel.
There you go. All right. So, just so that, can I get a mic on here? Yeah, okay. Just because they jumped right into it. So, Julia Jackson, whose world is called Grounded now, is something you can research. Again, all this information will be there. Julia is also hosting the group of Next Generation members. So this passion will be taken there. That is where they will be thinking about this. There was obviously little lack of appreciation for how passionate every single person here is. I have to give a special thanks out to Mike, Jonah Whitcamper, again, for those of you who don't necessarily have programs in front of you. So it's Julia, Jonah Whitcamper, Bobby Dunphy is, and I had several questions for you guys. You answered every one of them, especially to make sure about the donor advised funds and the fact that Bobby's World is really helping multiple generations within a given family figure out what they may specifically want to do in terms of sustainability issues, and addresses it that way. And Julia, if you think about what the whole School of Sustainability, the PACS, the Philanthropy and Civil Society, if you haven't yet met Priya, you guys need to do that, because you two are clearly important in terms of how folks like this can philanthropically do it. We heard from Emmy Sobieski earlier that you can also do this as a direct business. So whether you're approaching sustainability and the climate issues, the carbon issues, philanthropically as an active business, or to go back to thanking Mike, a good friend, a co-investor in investment deals, David Goon, is ICE's head of strategy across dimensions, and yet again doing another transaction. I don't know how many of you, put your hand up if you know who ICE is. Okay, not that many. All right, the Intercontinental Exchange is the parent of the New York Stock Exchange, the parent of the Depository Trust Clearing Corporation, the parent of Encompass, which is the largest real estate exchange whenever there's a purchase or sale of any real estate at this point, and the creator of the carbon credit itself, the future. From Fred's perspective, which is in the investment side of all this, that can't happen without the transparency that gets created by these futures markets. So when you think about who was up here right now, recognize how many tentacles of opportunity you have to approach the right people with the right questions. And you guys covered an incredible amount in a short period of time. Fred, thank you. And again, our applause.